My time at San Quentin ended the way it did at nearly all of my other prisons. First thing in the morning, a couple of officers came to my cell, strip searched me, put me into a paper jumpsuit, and escorted me to a transport cage. A transport cage is a cage that's in an open area somewhere near the entrance to the institution, probably in a processing area. It's about the size of half of a basketball court. It has a toilet, a sink, a couple of stone benches, and generally about a half dozen inmates sleeping on the floor waiting to get onto the bus the next morning. You see, CDC only transfers inmates between the hours of 0330 in the morning, 3:30 a.m., and 1700, 5 p.m. They do this because these are the hours in which inmates are able to be outside of an institution without being counted. They count every inmate in CDC at 5 p.m. and at 3:30 a.m. As a result, if you can't reach the institution to which you are being transported before 5 p.m., if the bus is still on the road at 3:30 or so, they have a scheduled stop. They have a prison that they'll go to. They'll take you off the bus, they'll move you into a transport cage, and you'll sleep on the floor until the next morning at 3:30 a.m. when they'll put you back on a bus, possibly not the same one, and hopefully get you closer to your final destination. You see, California is a pretty large state. As a result, sometimes it can take 2, 3, even 4 layovers, each one involving sleeping overnight on a concrete floor in an open atrium, in order to get to the institution you're finally going to be housed at. The administration manipulates this legal loophole called bus time in order to punish inmates or delay lawsuits. You see, whenever you're being transported from one institution to another, you're still an American citizen and you have all of the rights you would expect, but some are suspended because the administration can't reasonably be expected to provide them. For instance, you have a right to be able to receive mail and send mail, but obviously this right is suspended whenever you're being transported from institution to institution. You don't have access to paper or pen, and they certainly can't be expected to hunt you down and give you the mail. Similarly, your due process rights are suspended. You are not able to file legal paperwork, make complaints, appeals, anything like that. As a result, if you particularly offend the administration, or perhaps you have some dirt on them and they're trying to deter you from filing a lawsuit, they can just have you transported across the state in a circuitous route, making sure that you stop at every single prison between where you started and where you're going. Inmates can spend weeks on a bus. In fact, whenever I transferred from San Quentin to High Desert State Prison, there was an inmate who was in one of the small plexiglass cages. You see, the bus is a long row, and there are 4 plexiglass cages set off to the sides of the bus. 3 long benches here where inmates are shackled to a bar in the middle, and then there is a chain link fence with a lock that separates the driver and his 2 gunners from the inmates. Whenever I was being transported, I was in one of the plexiglass cages. The inmate on the other side of the bus was speaking to somebody on the benches. I couldn't really talk to him, and he was whispering because you're not allowed to talk, but it's a long bus ride, and I was able to hear what he was saying. He was doing bus time. He had been a little over a week trying to transfer from the Corcoran shoe to the Pelican Bay shoe. And every day they just moved him to another prison. And he was very happy because he was finally transporting from San Quentin, where he'd slept in a little cage, to High Desert, which is where this bus was going to stop. High Desert is very close to Pelican Bay. He was hopeful the next day he'd finally be done with this torturous trip that he was enduring. Unfortunately, the bus lay over at Solano and let a couple of inmates out, and he was one of them. He began yelling at the bus drivers. He was really upset because he wanted to keep going north, and he didn't want to stop in Central California. The bus drivers must have understood that he was under a lot of stress and had been enduring this for over a week, because they were pretty kind and they didn't beat the hell out of him whenever he mouthed off to them. You see, transport officers are known as some of the more aggressive and violent CDC guards. This makes sense. It actually serves a function. Transporting inmates has to be an intrinsically dangerous activity. This is whenever an inmate would try and escape, and some of the most dangerous inmates do eventually need to be transported. As a result, guards who have a propensity for bullying, violence, being a little more aggressive than is strictly necessary in their duties, there are some jobs that they get shifted into because these traits may be useful, and transport officer is one of those jobs. You don't mouth off to a transport officer, you don't anything. It's yes or no, sir, and you do what you're told. There's an urban legend in CDC. An inmate was supposed to have mouthed off to a transport officer, and the two gunners picked him up, turned him upside down, and physically put him into one of these plexiglass cages upside down, locked it. Again, these cages are narrow and they're short. If you're a tall guy like me, there is not enough room to anything. You're hunched in. As a result, if you are upside down and the door is closed, you will be unable to right yourself. The story goes that he passed out in a bad position and caused nerve damage to his spine, resulting in him being permanently paralyzed. I call this an urban legend because I heard it a lot. Everybody knew somebody who had been there when this happened a couple of years ago. But whenever I Googled it, it apparently didn't happen, or at least didn't make the papers, which is perhaps more likely. I never saw that degree of force used against an inmate, though Speedy did say that he saw somebody turned upside down and put into a plexiglass cage one time. But I did see an inmate have all of his property just lost by a transport officer at a prison he wasn't being housed in because he had offended the transport officer. It's 13 and a half hours from whenever you get on the bus to whenever you get off the bus. A little less dependent, but it can be an incredibly long day. It can be a painful day. I'm 6 feet tall and it's a small cage. You have to hunch in just a little. Small discomforts can become large discomforts, can become agonizing, can become torture if you endure them for long enough. On this bus ride, I felt a cramp, just a little pinch in my left thigh where I pulled it just a little doing squats a couple of days ago. And it wasn't a big deal, except that I was in this cage and I couldn't adjust my weight and try and get it to ease up. And this cramp and I had time to get to know each other. It really settled in. It was pinching and I was trying to find, and finally I found the position where it eased up and it relaxed. And I exhaled, and we're about an hour and a half, maybe 2 hours into the bus ride whenever it came back. Bigger and badder than ever because I was still in this uncomfortable position. And again, as every 20 minutes, half hour, this cramp would come back, and each time it was worse, and I didn't know what I was going to do. This was a long bus ride I was going to be on, and I had no relief coming. It got to where whenever it hurt, I was in agony, and whenever it finally eased up, I would just spend the time stressing about it coming back because I knew it was going to. I got to thinking about other people that endure situations like this. This wasn't a unique thing to be stuck in a small box to not be able to move. I got to thinking about Buddhist monks meditating that I'd read about. They would sit motionless for hours and hours, and they would get itches, cramps, the same as I had. They had the option of standing up and releasing them, but they endured the pain. Or rather, they overcame it because they didn't view it as something to be endured, to just suffer through. They viewed the pain as a test, a way to separate themselves from their body and overcome the problem, to meditate through it, essentially. And then the cramp came back, and I took a breath, and I resolved that I wasn't going to endure the cramp. I was going to overcome the cramp. And it hurt, and you can just feel it pulling, and I can remember that pain because it lasted all stinking day. But whenever we pulled into the parking lot at High Desert, as I was telling myself like a little mantra, pain does not have to be endured, it can be overcome. You can be stronger through having experienced that pain. A cramp doesn't have to be endured, it can be overcome. It can make you stronger. And as the bus was stopping and I was starting the new part of my prison term, I told myself prison doesn't have to be endured. It can be overcome and make you a better man.